Hello and welcome into the JAXUSL Report along with Mauricio Ruiz. I'm Cole Pepper. Before we get started here, I want to make sure that you take the opportunity to go to JAXUSL.com right now. Put your season ticket deposits down. For as little as $25 a ticket, you can hold your place in line. It'll also help you get right to the front of the line when it comes to new big announcements coming for JAXUSL. And there are some big announcements coming for JAXUSL very soon. More details on that coming in the coming weeks. All right, let's get into it. Mauricio, we've talked a lot about JAXUSL. We've talked about the USL Championship and the playoffs and the national teams. But we're about a third of the way through the Premier League season right now, and there are some interesting things developing with regard to the top of the table for the battle for Champions League spots and for the relegation zone. So let's get right into this. Remember when the season started, you picked Arsenal to win the league. I picked Man City, and here's the top of the table. Arsenal's on the top, just a point ahead of Man City after the weekend's activities. What have you seen so far out of particularly the top four here in the Premier League standings?
Yeah, I think it's expected. Arsenal and Man City, I think everyone had them up there in the top four. Liverpool had a bit of a down year last year, but they finished strong. They completely revitalized their roster with so many new players. So they feel like they're back to themselves, back to being Liverpool. Aston Villa is really the surprise here because you have all these other big dogs. And Tottenham had a great start, a little bit out of it now. But Man U's starting to creep up. But Aston Villa, no one really expects them to be fighting in as well as they're doing, and they're legit. So can they stay? Can they keep the fight on this top four, top six? It really feels like a top 10. In the Prem, so many good teams up there.
Of course, top four, Champions League, it becomes a big factor here. Also talking about teams that want to climb into that Champions League participation, also battling, of course, to play in Europa Cup. But look at this. We put this into the other contenders probably with Tottenham, Manchester United, who are playing very well right now, Newcastle, and then Brighton, who have been one of the more enjoyable teams to watch this year. They haven't gotten the results as often sometimes as the performances maybe indicated. But what do you make of this next four in the top table?
Yeah, the interesting part of it is going to be depth. As they kind of go forward and who has the most depth to be able to endure not just a really tough Prem League. You start talking about like Boxing Day around Christmas and New Year's. So many games accumulated in a short span of time. If they go into this spread of games already down in numbers, you see Tottenham they didn't have a healthy center back this past week. And look at Man U, continue to play young players, are doing well. But if they go into that period, plus Champions League, the ones that are playing Champions League or Europa League, that's going to be really the separator. So then he kind of gets into the conversation of what do they do in the transfer window? Because Newcastle is a team that got into the Champions League last year. They've endured a little bit of the storm, but you can see why they're hurting. And Man U is a team that you mentioned. I think they got 5 out of 6 in the last one, probably the hottest team in the league. Not playing brilliant, but getting results. So I think this next month of December, with so many games accumulated, is going to be interesting.
And that's maybe why Aston Villa has an advantage of a type, because they don't have to worry about those outside competitions cutting into some of their roster spots.
Well, then you also have the FIFA breaks, right? You have the international breaks. So the top teams, the big name teams, and Aston Villa has some, but not as many. I mean, those teams get complete, vacated during the FIFA breaks. Where some of the smaller teams like Brighton, maybe Aston Villa, they're able to retain a lot of their players during that time, so they get fresh, they get healthy. Where pretty much everyone else in the top four, top five, they go to the winter break, they go to the FIFA break, and they may come back injured.
Yeah, and certainly having to deal with travel, which is always a short-term issue for players who are traveling internationally. Of course, the other side of the table at the bottom, this is where the relegation zone comes into play. Luton Town gained promotion last season, and they're hovering just above the relegation spot. The interesting one here, Burnley has really struggled, but Everton, after a 10-point deduction, which is being appealed, by the way, so maybe they get a point or 2 or 3 back, that would certainly help them. But boy, you see Everton being in that's an unfamiliar spot for Everton to be in terms of the relegation zone.
Well, certainly in terms of points, it feels like the last couple of years, they keep fighting themselves out of relegation. They kind of get into that 17, 16, 15. It's been competitive at the bottom as well. It's probably the most competitive league from top to bottom in the world. But now getting themselves pushed all the way back down to 4 points. I mean, there's a lot of league to be played, and if anyone can do it, I mean, their roster is actually pretty good. They seem to be getting on the roll. They're putting together good performances. But man, when you get knocked down that deep, it'd be interesting to see what the environment looks like if they feel justified. Some other teams in the league have had some similar accusations as well. But Burnley just really can't get it going. Vincent Kompany did a great job with them coming up for his first year, out of the championship, and they just haven't seemed to kind of get their stride going so far.
All right, it's a struggle for those teams, sometimes by their own doing, sometimes by their lack of performances. You see Burnley and Sheffield United both on just one victory this year. All right, who's been your most disappointing side this year in the Premier League?
I'll stick with Burnley. I think I had an expectation just because of the pedigree that Vincent Kompany kind of brought, how well they performed. Not that I expect them to be even in the top 10, but I think they were a team that showcased enough and had a good enough roster to get into the Prem and maintain themselves a little bit high. He does play a brand that maybe necessarily doesn't bode well to the Prem with not necessarily having the right players for it. But if they can't stay, then it's kind of that yo-yo kind of back and forth that many teams have gone through before. So I expected them to be maybe in that 14th, 15th, as we've seen Nottingham Forest before, Brentford before, even Fulham when they've kind of had a couple up and down. So I'm a little disappointed that they haven't got more points this year. They haven't been more difficult to play against.
Yeah, I would also say Chelsea fans would be disappointed with where they are on the table. Higher expectations that they would be maybe a top 4 team this year hasn't materialized so far. Most surprising side of the first third of the season?
Oh, you would have to say Aston Villa. If you picked for, Chelsea probably would have been in our top 6 based on what they've done in the offseason. Man U and everyone else, even Newcastle. Brighton had a good year last year, so they're not surprising they're in the top 7. But no one would have expected, because West Ham, we forget West Ham. West Ham is fighting that 8th, 9th spot as well. But Aston Villa, we know they're a good team, good side, good international players. But for them to be contained about midway through the season in 4th place, I think that's something.
Will you change your thought on who will win the league this year based on what you've seen through the first 13 weeks?
No, I won't change it, because I think Arsenal were so close last year, and where they faltered is the lack of depth. So they did a fantastic job in the offseason to creating depth within the team. I do think that they're still missing that big target forward that seems that every other team has. Liverpool has that in Darwin Núñez, obviously Haaland for City. They don't really have that in Keita or Jesus or Havertz. They thought he was going to be that guy. So it'll be interesting to see if they bring someone in the transfer window and they can solidify that number 9 position. I think they're a team that can kind of run away with it a little bit, because they're about as good as anyone right now, not having that player. They're kind of scoring by committee. So I'll stick with them and see how they do.
All right, I'm going to stick with my pick of Man City. I know it was sort of the chalk pick, the easy pick, and they have led most of the way. Just fell out this last weekend out of the top spot, but I'm going to stick with it. We'll revisit this later on in the Premier League season. Also, some news around Jacksonville and soccer in general. The family of Tom Piatak, the CEO of Jacksonville-based Magellan Transportation Logistics, have acquired control of a British soccer team, the League One football club, Carlisle United. So now there are 3 Jacksonville connections with ownership in English football. We know about Shad Khan and Fulham, and also Bill Foley of Fidelity National Financial, and the Black Knight, and his group that owns AFC Bournemouth, a Premier League club. Boy, it's interesting that there are these Jacksonville connections now with what's going on with the Premier League. Of course, a lot more international ownership of English soccer teams. You can go from Wrexham on up to see some of those things. But interesting that Jacksonville has this synergy with some of these English clubs.
Yeah, and hopefully that builds well into, as we kind of get JAXUSL going in the next couple of years, potentially some collaborative work in the future with these clubs and JAXUSL. But I think American owners, American organizations are seeing international football, and certainly in England, as kind of probably the number 1 product financially, as a true investment, and as a true opportunity also to look at their teams as a vehicle to get their brand out globally a little bit more. We're talking about Magellan, probably one of the biggest national transportation companies, but kind of start broadening their horizon globally, internationally. So the fact that we have more and more Fortune 500 companies coming to Jacksonville because we're growing, especially after COVID, and to have 3 Premier League level, Carlisle is a really historic team, but two in the Prem right now that are based ownership out of Jacksonville. I think that's exciting for our fans to have that link, and then certainly for us as professionals in the space to be able to kind of collaborate over time.
Interesting too. We'll see what happens with Carlisle United, because they are in what is the 3rd division of soccer in England. in League One, trying to avoid relegation right now, but if they can work their way up and get up to the championship or get up to the Premier League eventually, that really, talk about growing the value of a club. We know how much of a difference that can make to be promoted through the ranks.
And that's when ownership typically tends to buy, right? When you buy low,
right?
And so they've been struggling a little bit. They've kind of got relegated over the years, but it is one of those teams that kind of right on the border of Scotland, Northern England. Really big soccer culture there, really fanatic. So if the new ownership group, the Jacksonville-based ownership group, can buy the team, can put some funding into it, into the second half of the season, and at least stay in League One for year one, I think there'll be success. And now as they kind of start looking, projecting, going forward, maybe the goal will start kind of getting into the championship, and eventually to the Prem.
And it's going to be fun to watch. Another local connection to English football to keep an eye on here in Jacksonville. A reminder to like and subscribe to our Facebook page, to all of our social media channels, as well as here on YouTube. And be sure to get your tickets, subscriptions, your deposits down, because that'll be your first entry into getting some of the big news that's coming very soon from JAXUSL. For Mauricio Ruiz, I'm Cole Pepper. Thanks for watching the JAXUSL Report.